He was called the most beautiful man in Hollywood. 6 feet 2 inches of raw, magnetic presence, a man so naturally striking that a movie producer once pulled his photograph out of a wastebasket just to track him down and offer him a film role. Victor Mature was supposed to be invincible. He was the kind of man who wrestled lions on screen, survived the North Atlantic during World War II, and laughed off his critics with a wit so sharp it could cut glass. But behind that confident grin and those dark, hooded eyes, Victor Mature carried burdens that few people ever knew about. He kept secrets about who he really was, what he truly wanted, and what it cost him to become a legend. And in the final years of his life, as his eyesight slowly dimmed and a devastating illness crept through his body, the real Victor Mature began to surface. What he revealed changed the way the people who loved him understood everything. This is the story of a man who gave the world a performance for decades, not just on screen, but in life, and what happened when the curtain finally came down. Victor John Mature was born on January 29, 1913, in Louisville, Kentucky, into a working-class household shaped by immigrant ambition and old-world discipline. His father, Marcello Galindo Maturi, had come to America from Pinzolo in the Italian Tyrol region, a man who sharpened knives and cutlery for a living and who believed that hard work was the only honest path forward. His mother, Clara Ackley, was Kentucky-born with Swiss roots, a woman of quiet strength who kept the family grounded. From the very beginning, Victor's childhood was marked by both energy and loss. His older brother, Marcellus, died of osteomyelitis when Victor was just 5 years old. His infant sister Isabel never survived past birth. Victor grew up in a home that had already known grief before he was old enough to fully understand it, and that early encounter with mortality would quietly shape the man he became. He was not a studious boy. School after school expelled him for his boisterous personality and refusal to sit still. He passed through St. Xavier High School, the Kentucky Military Institute, and the Spencerian Business School without leaving much of an academic mark on any of them. What he did possess, even then, was a quality that no classroom could teach, an almost supernatural physical presence and a charm that made people stop and look. He worked alongside his father selling butcher supplies, then sold candy, then ran a small restaurant. But none of it felt right. Victor Mature wanted something more, something bigger, and in 1935, at the age of 22, he sold the restaurant, put what little money he had in his pocket, and headed to California. The story of how he arrived in Pasadena with barely 11 cents to his name became something of a family legend. He reportedly wired his father to say he had arrived in Hollywood with 11 cents and asked what he should do. His father, a man who had crossed an ocean with 6 cents and no English, told him he was already ahead of where he had started. That exchange said everything about the Mature family, immigrant grit dressed up in dry humor. Victor enrolled at the Pasadena Community Playhouse and, for 3 years, lived in a tent in a fellow student's backyard. He appeared in nearly 60 plays, learning his craft the hard way, absorbing everything the stage could teach him about presence, timing, and emotional truth. The break came, as so many Hollywood breaks did, through a strange mixture of luck and looks. Producer Hal Roach had been sorting through promotional material and noticed a photograph of a young man with a jaw like carved marble and eyes that practically smoldered through the paper. Roach tracked him down and offered him a small role in the 1939 comedy The Housekeeper's Daughter. The audience response was immediate. Fan mail flooded in, 20,000 letters after just one film. Hal Roach knew exactly what he had. Victor Mature was quickly cast as the lead caveman in 1 Million BC in 1940, a role that made him a star almost overnight and earned him the nickname that would follow him for the rest of his life, the beautiful hunk of man. But even at the peak of his early fame, Victor was living with a quiet tension that few people recognized. He had arrived in Hollywood as a working-class boy from Kentucky with an Italian immigrant father and holes in his ambitions that fame couldn't quite fill. The Hollywood establishment of the 1940s was a world of country clubs and cocktail parties and old-money confidence, and Victor Mature, despite every physical advantage, never entirely belonged to it. He was aware, acutely aware, that the critics did not take him seriously. The powerful Romanoff Round Table, where the elite of Hollywood gathered, kept its doors firmly closed to him. Studio chief Darryl Zanuck once told director John Ford privately that Victor Mature was one of the most underrated performers in the business, that the public adored him and that every picture he appeared in made money, and yet the intelligentsia refused to acknowledge what was in front of them. Victor heard that message in various forms throughout his career, and it settled into him like a splinter he could never quite locate or remove. Rather than rage against it, Victor Mature did something far more interesting. He turned the wound into a weapon. He became famous for dismissing his own talent before anyone else could do it for him. When an exclusive Los Angeles country club rejected his membership application because he was an actor, Victor reportedly responded with perfect comic timing, "I'm not an actor, and I've got 64 films to prove it." The line became one of the most quoted in Hollywood history. In interview, he told journalists that his real occupation was golf. He said he had never been an actor at all, just a man with a compulsion to earn money. He laughed at himself so consistently and so publicly that people began to wonder if he was joking or if he was telling a truth too large to say plainly. The truth was more complicated than either version. Victor Mature could act. His performance as the doomed Doc Holliday in John Ford's My Darling Clementine in 1946 was so quietly devastating that Richard Burton, after working alongside him in The Robe in 1953, openly admitted that Mature had made him feel like an amateur. His work in the 1947 film noir Kiss of Death brought real menace and depth to a genre that often settled for surface. These were not the performances of a man who couldn't act. They were the performances of a man who had decided, somewhere along the way, that pretending not to care was safer than admitting how much he did. His personal life ran on a similarly complicated track. Victor Mature was married 5 times. His first marriage, to actress Frances Charles in 1938, was brief and annulled within 2 years. His second wife, Martha Kemp, was gone within 2 years as well. His third marriage, to Dorothy Stanford Berry, lasted from 1948 to 1955, the span of his greatest commercial success. His fourth marriage, to Adrienne Joy Erwick, endured a decade before ending in 1969. For marriages, for endings, for sets of promises that ultimately couldn't hold. The painful secret buried within all of this wasn't scandal. It was loneliness. Victor Mature, the man whose image defined masculine confidence for a generation of moviegoers, was a man who found real intimacy extraordinarily difficult. He craved connection but struggled to maintain it. The roles he played on screen, the heroic warrior, the faithful soldier, the man of conviction, were in many ways the opposite of what he found easy to inhabit in private. He also carried the weight of something he rarely spoke about publicly, the war. When the United States entered World War II, Victor Mature attempted to enlist in the military. He failed the initial visual test. The irony was not lost on him. The man whose face was everywhere, whose eyes were among the most photographed in the country, had eyes that didn't quite measure up to military standards. The United States Coast Guard accepted him, however, and from July 1942 to November 1945, Victor Mature served his country with a seriousness that surprised people who had only seen his movie persona. He traveled the North Atlantic, including the beaches of Normandy. He sailed through the Mediterranean, the Caribbean, and the South Pacific. He was stationed on Okinawa when the atomic bomb fell on Japan. He saw things that men of his generation carried silently for the rest of their lives, tucked away behind their public faces, and Victor was no different. He came home, resumed his career, and said almost nothing about what he had witnessed. It was in 1949 that the role arrived that would define him in the public imagination forever. Director Cecil B. DeMille chose Victor Mature to play Samson in the biblical spectacular Samson and Delilah. DeMille described the character as a combination of Tarzan, Robin Hood, and Superman. The film cost $3.5 million to make and earned back more than $12 million at the box office, making it the most commercially successful film of the decade. Victor Mature was Samson, the physical embodiment of power, faith, and ultimately, sacrifice. What few people discussed was the irony running through that performance. Samson, in the biblical story, is a man of immense strength who is brought low, who loses his sight, who is stripped of everything before his final act of defiance. Victor Mature played that story for the cameras, and then, decades later, began to live a quieter version of it himself. The eyesight that had once failed his military entrance examination began to deteriorate seriously in his later years. It was a gradual process, the kind that announces itself slowly and then accelerates without warning. The man who had always relied on his eyes, on that famous dark, expressive gaze that could carry an entire scene without a single word, found himself increasingly limited by failing vision. For a private person who had built an entire identity around controlling his own image and narrative, losing the ability to see clearly was deeply personal. He did not make theatrical declarations about it. He adjusted, as he had always adjusted, quietly, with the same dry composure that had served him through everything else. By the time Victor Mature found genuine contentment in his life, he was in his 60s. His fifth and final marriage, to Loretta Gay Sabina in 1974, was different from everything that had come before. Loretta was an opera singer, a woman of warmth and musical soul, and she stayed. She did not leave. Their marriage lasted until the last moment of his life, 25 years of real partnership, of the kind of domestic peace that Victor had spent decades trying and failing to build. And in 1975, at the age of 62, Victor Mature became a father for the first and only time. His daughter Victoria was born, and by every account, fatherhood cracked open something in him that even fame had not been able to reach. Victoria, who would go on to inherit her mother's operatic talent, was the apple of his eye. The man who had played warriors and heroes and men of iron conviction finally had someone for whom he would openly and unguardedly feel everything. It was in the quieter conversations of his later years, away from interviews designed to entertain and towards something more honest, that Victor began to let certain truths surface. He acknowledged that for most of his career, the self-deprecating persona had been armor. Saying "I'm not an actor" before anyone else could say it meant the critics never got the first strike. Admitting he only cared about money meant no one could accuse him of failing to achieve artistic greatness. He had been, in a very deliberate and rather sophisticated way, managing his own vulnerability by making the vulnerability part of the joke. Beneath the humor was a man who had genuinely wanted to be taken seriously, who had watched lesser-regarded contemporaries win the recognition that was withheld from him, and who had learned to swallow that disappointment with a grin so convincing it looked like happiness. He also, in the final chapter of his life, began to speak more openly about the loneliness of those early years, the marriages that failed not because of dramatic collapse but because he hadn't yet learned how to truly be present for another person. He had spent so much of his life performing that he sometimes couldn't locate himself beneath the performance. Fame had arrived before he had finished becoming who he was, and it had frozen a version of him in place while the real man continued to search. He said, in various ways and in various contexts, that the only time he had ever felt completely himself was on the golf course, where there was no script and no audience and the only thing that mattered was the honesty of the shot. In 1998, Victor Mature was diagnosed with leukemia. He was 85 years old. He had lived a full life by almost any measure, 60-plus films, a star on the Hollywood Walk of Fame at 6780, Hollywood Boulevard, a military service record, a late-found marriage and a beloved daughter, a retirement spent in the California sunshine with a golf club in his hand. The leukemia moved through him with the kind of quiet authority that cannot be argued with or charmed or laughed off. Loretta was with him. Victoria was near. The people who had known the real man, beneath the beautiful hunk of man persona, gathered close. On August 4, 1999, Victor John Mature passed away at his home in Rancho Santa Fe, California. He was 86 years old. He was buried in Louisville's St. Michael Cemetery, alongside his parents and siblings, back in the Kentucky earth where the story had begun, back near the graves of the brother who died young and the sister who never got a chance and the immigrant father who had arrived in America with 6 cents and a will to survive. Victor had arrived in Hollywood with 11 cents and a face that stopped traffic, and he had made something remarkable and strange and human out of everything that followed. What Victor Mature revealed in the quieter stretches of his final years was not a scandal or a sensational confession. It was something more difficult and more honest than that. he revealed that the armor had always been armor. That the laughter at his own expense had been a form of grief management. That the man who played Samson, blinded, stripped of his power, standing between the pillars in the darkness, had understood something about that role from the inside. That losing your sight, literal or figurative, forces a reckoning that physical strength cannot prevent. And that the life he was most proud of was not the one the cameras had captured, it was the smaller, quieter one. The one with Loretta. The one with Victoria practicing her scales in the next room. The one where he didn't have to perform. The Hollywood that made Victor mature a star rarely gave him the credit he deserved while he was alive and prominent enough to receive it. The critics who dismissed him were measuring him against a standard he had never claimed to be pursuing. What they missed, and what the people closest to him understood, was that Victor Mature was one of the most emotionally intelligent men to ever walk through those studio gates, intelligent enough to know that surviving Hollywood required a very specific kind of disguise, and disciplined enough to wear it every single day for decades. The painful secret was not shameful. It was simply human. He wanted to be seen. He spent a lifetime making sure he would not be. And in the end, in the stillness of Rancho Santa Fe with his wife beside him and his daughter's voice in his memory, he finally allowed himself to be exactly who he had always been. Victor Mature deserved more flowers when he could still smell them. But the ones he carried quietly, the love, the humor, the dignity, the hard-won peace of his final years, those were real, and those were his, and no critic or country club or studio system could ever take them away.